In the dead of night, when the moon is high and ill winds blow, and the banshees cry and the moonlight casts an unearthly glow, arise, my love, with tales of woe.
Good evening. It is 12 midnight, the paranormal hour. Welcome to Ghost to Ghost. I'm your host, Chief Lawson. Ghost to Ghost is a podcast to discuss all paranormal and parapsychology subjects. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats, so tell your friends, tell your family. Come listen to Ghost to Ghost. Good evening. Our topic for tonight is the origins of ghosts and our beliefs in them. Tonight, I have as my guests Jennifer Verne, our research manager on Spirit, Heather Lawson, our trainer on Spirit, and Andrew Brooks, my chief of staff. Welcome, guys.
Hi, Chief.
Hi.
Let's talk about where ghosts first appeared in the historical record.
Yeah, when people normally think of the historical record, they either think of Dickens' 1843 Christmas Carol, or some people tie it back to the Bell Witch Cave in Adams, Tennessee. But, Jennifer, it goes back much further than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure goes back further. The Charles Dickens is not the first mention of ghosts.
What about Pliny, the elder of the ancient Rome? In Book 7, Letter 27, the Surah, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. Feel free to correct me if I'm not. The Pliny relates a tale of a house for rent that can't hold a tenant due to a restless ghost that would walk the halls every night, clanging its chains. And I hate to say this, but we've had several cases where tenants wouldn't stay in a house. So what about that, Jennifer?
This isn't the first either. That story is really rather fascinating. If you're interested, I would certainly recommend looking it up. It kind of reminds you of Ebenezer Scrooge, because the guy that does rent the house is kind of a miser, and he's renting the house because he knows he can get a good rate on the rent. And he actually tells the ghost to leave him alone because he's busy with his accounting books and whatnot. And he actually is able to put the ghost to rest. I'll have
to read, yeah.
It's a really fascinating story, but it is not the first either.
There's an Akkadian tablet called the Incantation to Utu. Utu is a god who must pass judgment upon death in order for the spirit to move on. If the spirit is found lacking, they're denied entrance to the underworld. Very Egyptian theme going on there. You can see where that kind of came to them from. This tablet states, "He whose judgment has not been passed is a ghost who frightens people in dreams." It mentions that another way a person could become a ghost is one who has no one to remember them, no one to carry on offerings in their memory. And it says, "A ghost who has no one to pour water, or a wind man who has no spouse, or a man whose name was destroyed, or not covered by a grave." King Ashur, I knew I would mispronounce that. King Ashurbanipal of Nineveh, in a tablet from 643 BCE, talks of how he took revenge on the Elamites by destroying their tombs of the kings. He says, "I took their bones and prevented their ghosts from sleeping."
This goes back to disturbing burial sites.
You know, there are so many times when we get calls from folks who tell us that they've found bones in the backyard. They worry of some issue of bad things, or they're having some things happening, and they're concerned that this is possibly the reason. And, you know, let's face it, Indiana has tons of, Indian burial sites. We have tons of both Civil War, Confederate, and Union alike. And we have probably some, just avid venturers and so forth that have perished and were buried. And we were talking about earlier about the family plots, like the Cinnameyer plot. And if you look on a map, you'll see the little crosses and so forth. And this is one of the neatest things because back then you could be buried. I've told the wife that when I die, I want us to be buried on our property. That way the kids have to come see us because they have to mow the grass. And, I want that way. We kind of laugh. But I got to tell you this one story about burial rites. We were talking about this, and we were talking about this earlier. And there's a couple of comedy routines. One of them is by Ray Stevens, one of my favorite comedians. It's called Sitting Up with the Dead. And we were talking about this earlier. The traditions that we have that surround death and the ceremonies that lead into that. One of the neat things with this song, if you haven't seen it, download the video and watch it. It's called Sitting Up with the Dead. And essentially, it was a habit back in the South, Appalachia, and not just necessarily South, some areas in the North, that when someone would pass away, that especially if you're in a rural area, there wasn't a lot of funeral homes like there were today. Someone didn't come pick the body up. The neighbors would come in and wash and clean the body and dress them for the funeral. And you'd clear out your living room, and you would have the preacher come over, and you would show your relatives there in your living room. And you didn't want to leave the dead alone. Now, I'm thinking about this, thinking, why, but whatever the reason being, you would sit up with the dead. And in this particular comedy skit he has, they have an arthritic Uncle Fred who's very bent over, and the morticians decide to come in from the big city, and they're trying to help with the body. And and back then they didn't embalm everybody. So they take logging chains to hold him down and cover up the chains so they're not noticeable. The problem is, the night of the wake, there's a horrible thunderstorm that comes, and someone bumps the casket. And when they do, old Fred sits right up in the casket. And this is after the power has went out, and it comes the great parting of the folding chairs, and people are screaming. And, there's another story, Jerry Clowers, who's a great comedian, country comedian, tell us about two old boys that from a family have to sit with a relative. And they're sitting there, and one of the old boys looks at the other and says, hey, I can look out that window and I can see a neon sign to a bar. You stay here, I'll go get us a couple beers. And he goes, oh, no, you're not leaving me with this dead man. There's no way. And neither one of them knew the relative very well. The other one says, you stay here and I'll go get the beers. He says, no, that's not going to happen. So they both end up actually getting the corpse out of the casket and walking over to the bar. Of course, he's the best dressed guy in this small little town neighborhood bar. And the odd thing and the funny thing about it is, fight breaks out and someone accidentally hits the dead man, who hits the floor, and another guy goes, oh my God, you killed him. And needless to say, the sheriff arrives, and they found out they've taken the corpse from the funeral home drinking. So anyway, and I don't think that's a normal traditional practice, but there's a lot of practices out there. Anybody want to chime in on that?
Well, actually, that funeral practice kind of ties back into Dr. Finkel in actuality, because the idea of the wake, sitting up with the corpse, could have possibly been a way to prevent people from being buried alive. People thought they were dead, but they actually weren't dead. And Dr. Finkel goes on, was talking about the ancient Victorian practices of elaborate bell systems and whatnot.
Yes, I remember those.
In case you were buried alive, you would have a bell that you can pull, and the sexton of the cemetery would be there to revive you. Mm-hmm. And he says that the idea of the wind, of the breath having to leave the body from ancient Mesopotamian, could have been in response to that fear of someone had been buried alive. So they need to make sure the eldest son, actually was his responsibility to make sure that the breath or the wind had left the body of his deceased father before he was actually buried.
Well, there's another thing too. Unfortunately, being a paramedic, I can tell you, when you have to move someone who is recently deceased, they sometimes will breathe what they call the last breath, and they'll exhale. And for someone who's not ready for it, it's a little disturbing. And I had a captain that worked for me, and he told me this story, and he was moving a body. He worked for part-time for Community South, which was University Heights Hospital. And apparently they were moving a body, and he had a rookie EMT, first time out, and they were trying to get the body onto the stretcher properly so they could take it out and take it to the morgue. And apparently the rookie was at the head of the gurney. And about that time, the body shifted due to a muscle spasm and let out a breath. And apparently, he passed my captain at the foot of the body. He said, "I'm not sure how he did it. He bow-legged it all the way down the casket, shoved me aside, and kept going." And he said, "I had to go find him. He almost made the elevator before." He says, "Luckily, I got there before the elevator did." So, that could have something to do with that last breath. So,
Yeah.
Anybody else want to put in?
Well, this is going back, but you mentioned about burial sites and not disturbing them. And I always find this, I always think of this one, the John Wilkes Booth burial site.
Oh, yeah.
That, for those of you who are not familiar, when John Wilkes Booth was captured at Garrett's farm, he had 3 vertebrae taken from his neck, and he was buried, and then I think he was moved to the Wilt family burial site. Over the years, the conspiracy theories have come up whether it was actually John Wilkes Booth or not. And so they now have the ability to DNA test, especially if they can cross-link, especially that the body found there, if it was actually John Wilkes Booth. Well, there is a big controversy about disturbing the John Wilkes Booth burial site. And
isn't the family throwing a fit or something? They don't want it disturbed?
Well, yes. And part of me says, he was the assassination of the president, and I don't really care about his eternal peace. But at the same time, it goes into our long-standing traditions of not disturbing a burial site unless you have a really good unless there is a home run of a reason.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And actually, burial grounds in ancient Mesopotamia were extremely important. You can see in their funerary practices just how important that was. Just like in the Egyptians, the afterlife, you were expected to go into an afterlife and need the things that you had. So the rich elite kings and such would have tombs like pharaohs, with grave goods and servants and furniture, livestock buried with them. Just look at the terracotta warrior tomb in China.
Oh, yeah.
Similar aspect with the Mesopotamian kings. People of lesser wealth, but who were still important and had the money, they would have underground stone crypts or sarcophagi that they would be buried in. These would be accessible because all the relatives were placed in a central grave, kind of like what a mausoleum would be today. Now, they didn't have coffins or things. It was more like the Jewish practice of the ossuaries, where they would put the bodies in, the decay, and they would push the bones aside when the next relative came in, that sort of thing. And that was also a central place for offerings to be performed. For the most part, the typical burials of family and loved ones would be in the homes. So their homes were like square homes around a central courtyard, kind of think Greek style, with the home wrapped around the outside with the central courtyard in the middle. And the family would live in generational groups. And so the dead were actually buried underneath the floors of the homes.
Wow.
Yes, and if it was an infant or a young child, they could be actually buried within the walls. Now, we had talked earlier about cremation. Cremation was actually a practice in ancient Mesopotamia as well. Not as often, but it was. And the ashes were kept in the tombs along with the bones of the other relatives as well. These households would then incorporate the shrines into that burial area. And the bread would be offered at a shrine, kind of like you think of the ancient Chinese and even Latin American with their shrines to their dead. And there was also a spout that would go down into the ground, and water was offered to the dead relatives on a routine basis. That's why you see a lot of times no water offerings. That would create a ghost. If you didn't have family to present that water offering to the ground,
and
you could have had a ghost come.
Let's talk about cremation for a minute, because, we were talking about earlier, there's more and more of that done, and it's incredible the amount of problems this presents, because people want their ashes spread, and they don't realize how awkward a situation this is, because one, it's illegal unless you have the right area. And I think, Andrew, you have a little bit of knowledge, because he has a relative that works at Disney World. And I know they have this. Do you know a little bit about the Disney World problem? Okay, well, I know I've read a bit that apparently this is one of the favorite places to spread one's ashes. And they have a code, and I don't recall what it is. I'm sure some of our listeners will remember it. And when that's called, they have special HEPA vacuums. They go out and vacuum up the ashes and the bones. And, I'm sitting here thinking, because I also remember that it wasn't long ago in Lucas Oil Stadium, they found a bag of ashes taped to the back of the seat. Something like Uncle Roy wanted this. I'm thinking, and they have all these different, park areas and large places like arenas and things have processes because people are doing that, and, it's not uncommon. It's thought of. I know. I used to jokingly say years and years ago, in the shrine with a lot of Shriners, that I wanted to be cremated, my ashes buried at the Bunny Ranch. One, the Bunny Ranch is closed, and the late Michael St. Pierre used to remind me that it's a flammable hazard to try to cremate me. So anyway, he felt it would blow up the crematorium. So anyway, but yeah, you see a lot of this. Anybody want to chime in on cremation? Any stories or anything relative?
My own mother is cremated, but she wanted to be cremated because she's eligible to be buried at Arlington. But because there's so few places for an actual in-ground burial, she has to be cremated so she could be in what's it called? The place where they put the
sarcophagus?
No, kind of like a mausoleum.
A
mausoleum.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry.
There's spaces in mausoleums left. There's still plenty of those. But, so that's why she has to be cremated, so she can be put in Arlington.
Yep.
Everyone has a different reason why, and there's nothing wrong with it. It just, it's funny how some of those traditions, are looked at. So,
Well, it's funny because if you look at the reason for the catacombs in Paris,
sure,
the problem is that they had too many bodies in the ground as the city expanded, and so they had to pull that out. And the world just passed 8 billion people.
Yes.
You kind of have to wonder what's it going to be like in 100 years, 100, 200 years.
Yeah.
There is a practical aspect to
Well,
cremation.
and a lot of times mass graves were the result. I know when they were expanding, because I have numerous friends and brothers in England, and being Scottish, I talked to them frequently. One time they were expanding a subway, and they actually broke into one of the plague plots. He said, "Oh my God," he said, "you've never seen people move so fast." He said, because we thought it was part of the additional maybe catacombs and really didn't think about it. He says, of course, one of the archaeologists arrives and says, "Oh, no." He says, "You're standing in a plague." He says, about that time, he said, they cleared out, wouldn't work in it again. He said they had all kinds of issues. But, those were a lot of times, where, all the different plagues we've had. Of course, COVID-19, during that, I and my wife would go through several of the cemeteries, and you could count daily on how many new open graves had appeared, and luckily mass burial wasn't necessary. But we were talking, and before I turn this back over to Jennifer, we were talking about, small cemeteries, and it's really neat. I took a course many, many years ago, pre-college course, on thantology, and we went out and we would, look at burial sites and burial rituals and traditions, and we would make rubbings on some, and some of the stones are very interesting if you get into some of these small plots. And Sindemeyer, the one I was talking about earlier, is located up off of 700. It actually, the Sindemeyer family was kind of the wheel in New Pal and New Palestine, Indiana, and they have several additions there named after the Sindemeyers. And when you go through that area, but most of the time when you go through, you will find that, of course, if you're a bigger city like Indianapolis, you didn't have those plots. So, Jennifer, you'd like to take us on down with this?
Yeah, so you can see where the family unit is really cohesive here. And a lot of people were buried within their generational home there. But there were the occasional cemetery. Now, these were on the outskirts of the towns or cities. And they were usually avoided because they were renowned to have restless ghosts of unknown or unclaimed souls. Hence why they would probably be in a cemetery. They didn't have anybody to be buried inside their home. So those that didn't have anybody left to remember them, provide offerings for them, those usually would relate into a haunting. Usually hauntings by dead relatives can easily be fixed, but even if you were uncertainty uncertain of the identity of the ghost you're dealing with, it could easily be fixed by a few common recitations or offerings to appease the ghost. There were common vendors in the markets where you could go to obtain protection, amulets, and charms and talismans. They were either pre-made and generic, or you could have a personalized amulet made. There does still survive 2 small clay-baked beads that are just this sort of item of general protection. And the inscription is in Akkadian, and it reads, "Spell of God, Asulihi, ghost, do not keep coming in." A lot of these prayers and incantations would have been widely known, just as today we have prayers and sayings that we use for our own protection. One really interesting thing Dr. Finkel had mentioned was of Pazuzu. And we all know Pazuzu from the Exorcist movies, right?
Oh, yeah.
And we all think of him today as a fearsome demon and not to be mentioned and messed around with. However,
Thanks for bringing him up.
Yeah. I'm actually not too worried about it because this is a case of mistaken identity. Pazuzu was actually a protector of women in childbirth and of newborn infants. Idols and depictions of him are placed over the beds of pregnant women and newborns to ward off a demon called Lamashtu. Lamashtu would sulk around at night, sniffing out women, pregnant women, or women in labor, in order to feast upon them and or their newborn child. It was believed that the mere sight of Pazuzu's protection idol would drive her away instantly, thereby protecting the mother and the child. This Lamashtu type demon can still be seen today in Philippine lore in the form of an aswang. The aswangs are very feared in Philippines, and they also prey on pregnant women and infants in the same manner. If the situation of this haunting went on for a really long period of time, or became more dire in terms of physically affecting the person, they would call in spiritualists or the exorcists. So you could deal with it on your own. There were incantations and spells that you could have, but if this became really bad, you need to call the exorcists. And there's a tablet from Asher that tells of a case where a priest was called in to help. One part of this tablet reads, "A ghost smites me, making me ill. A ghost pursues me. All my flesh hurts. The muscles of my limbs are paralyzed." Sleep paralysis, anyone?
I'm thinking arthritis. I mean, yeah. I feel that way sometimes at night,
Right.
yeah.
So the priest would recite a complete listing of all possible spirits in order to make sure none are overlooked. I mean, we're talking, be ye died in a grave, be ye died on a ditch side, be you died of drowning, be you died of fire. They would
Sure.
list them all. It's like a 25-page list of all the different types of ghosts so they can do all of it. All manner of death and transgression are listed in this roll call fashion. And then any mention of any evil galu or demon is mentioned. Therefore, they can protect, everything.
Sure.
And this is repeated 3 times, again, with offering of bread and water, and even silver offering to the exorcist is made. And Dr. Finkel's like, I wonder if that silver went into the exorcist little purse there.
Yeah, that might have been his honorarium.
His honorarium fee. So, in the book, there's even a chapter on necromancy. But we're not going to dive into that because that chapter was very complicated. I had to read it a couple times and I still am a little bit lost. But
This all come from one book?
this is all one book. This
Wow.
is an amazing book. The First Ghosts by Dr. Irving Finkel. I recommend it highly. So the vast majority of the time in dealing with ghosts, the Mesopotamians wanted to get rid of the problem. They didn't want to invite them in. Dr. Finkel, as of right now, has yet to find any mention of spirits being called upon to do harm to another. Like, they would not call upon a spirit to curse somebody else. That was extremely taboo. That did not happen. And in his opinion, it would go very much against the grain of the Mesopotamians to do that. But there were times when necromancers would be called upon to get the deceased relative to answer a pressing question that the family had. And then immediately, that ghost was sent back to the netherworld, post-haste. The priests were very versed in omens and spells, making of amulets and plants and spices. Anything we would think of today in terms of shamans or witch doctors or even modern-day Wiccans. It was very common and very important aspect of their daily life. So then over the next 5,000 years of recorded history, we start to see a shift in that belief. What was once a natural given and understanding of everyday life is no longer a given in Western culture. Many cultures in Southeast Asia, such as the Torjan peoples, they're the ones that dress their deceased relatives and live with them in their homes.
Yes.
And bring them out and parade with them. The Japanese and Chinese shrines, their ancestors, their ancestor devotion is very important to that culture. The practice of Dia de los Muertos with Latin Americans.
Everybody can say that but me. I have a terrible time with that. Go ahead.
No matter how many times I try to help him, he still can't get it.
So these practices are all traced back to the ancient Mesopotamian beliefs. I mean, we can clearly see that. Ancient Egyptians, you can see it all over the place.
Sure.
Except in Western cultures, with the introduction of philosophies and religions and sciences, they have pushed a skepticism into the world of ghosts and the afterlife, and they ridicule it. This transfers the realm of the spirit from everyday observance of our ancestors to hushed conversations in dark rooms behind closed doors. So let's hope that we're seeing now a change and a return to a more open conversation on what happens after we die.
All right, folks, I want to thank Jennifer for all that research. That's a really good piece, and it's a lot of things that people don't know. I'm going to open this up for comments from everybody. So,
well, I mean, the comments that I have, I find it strange that in 4,000 years, how much has changed and how little has changed. That, in many ways, their reverence to the dead, the spirits. You mentioned building the amulets to honor the dead. I'll go back to Chicago. The Eastland disaster site. There were always reports of having ghosts there until they put a plaque down commemorating that this was the site of the Eastland disaster, and a lot of the ghost stories disappeared after that plaque went down. 4,000 years, 4,000 or 5,000 years, so much has changed, so much has stayed the same.
It's exactly what Dr. Finkel has said too, that it really makes you realize just how much we are similar to the ancients.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, side note, the Eastland wreck has had a lot of attention here lately, and that came up. And actually, there's a young lady who does a Mortician's channel. She does it, and I just kind of half watch it. She recently got barred from YouTube because they didn't like some of the things that she had said and some of what they thought were some of the photos that she put. And like she said, I don't have gruesome bodies and everything. I've seen videos that are really bad, and this wasn't one of them. But she actually got suspended, put in YouTube jail because of the Eastland filming. I actually watched it and saw nothing wrong with it. It was a really good documentary on what happened and how she does everything from a mortician standpoint of how the bodies and so forth would react. I was just curious of that because that plays into how ghosts are made. So makes a difference. It really does. So.
Well, you're talking about amulets. Well, a lot of people wear amulets every day. They wear them on their necks.
Yeah, I was going to bring up yours.
Oh.
The hand.
Oh, yeah. I got a hand of Fatima, but it has ojos de Dios in the middle.
Yes.
It's in English, it's ward against the evil eye.
Right. And
something everybody should know is my wife is Hispanic, so that's why she is saying that. So okay.
Yeah, and I have my grandmother's ashes blown into a glass charm that I wear.
Seen those.
And that's really popular.
I have a bracelet.
Yeah, it's to turn the family's cremated ashes into a keepsake to have.
Yeah.
I want to be put in a Scotch bottle when it's like 100 years old.
Oh, of course.
Something really nice.
Of
Yeah.
course, yes.
Something that we can put on the mantle.
I'll get a whole barrel made for you.
There we go. I've lost weight. Oh my God. Yeah. Anyway, all right. Anybody else like to add anything? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and close this up. Again, I want to thank Jennifer Verne, our research manager on Spirit. That's a great piece, and really, she does a lot of hard work for us. She helps put together this, and she is one of our producers on this, so really, we thank you very much, and we hope you enjoyed this. That is the conclusion of the origins of ghosts and the beliefs thereof. We ask you to certainly tune in and listen to us anytime we can. All right, listeners, it's time for our feature ghost story of the day. Today's presenter will be Jennifer Verne, research manager for Spirit Paranormal and producer for Ghost to Ghost podcast.
Our ghost story of the day comes from A Ghost a Day by Maureen Wood and Ron Kolick. The Haunted Dybbuk Box from Portland, Oregon. During World War II, a young Polish woman who had lost her parents, husband, and children in a Nazi concentration camp immigrated to America. One of the few items she brought with her was a wine cabinet. She was very protective of it. In fact, when asked about it, she would spit 3 times between her fingers and say, "A Dybbuk, a Kesslem." When she became an old woman, she requested the box be buried with her. She died at age 103. But the Orthodox rabbi wouldn't permit the box to be buried with her, so the Dybbuk box was included in her estate sale, where a young man who owned a furniture refinishing business purchased it. And for the further story, there are several places that you can find out exactly what has happened to this gentleman who purchased that.
Oh my God, there's been TV. Yeah, that's
everything.
We ought to do an episode on
We've seen
that.
a special, haven't we?
Yes, we have seen a special, and oh my God, some of the and actually the box was bought by someone who now still owns it. He's not a sensationalist. He's just got it in his home, but he doesn't want to turn loose of it. And we watched two specials on that. So again, that was the ghost story of the day, and thank you, Jennifer. We do appreciate that. Thanks for listening to Ghost. Again, I'm your host, Chief Lawson. You can find Ghost to Ghost on all major formats on the 15th and 30th of the month at midnight. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, maybe have a question or subject you'd like to ask about on air or be used on the show, please email us at ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com, ghosttoghost@spiritindiana.com. I want to thank my production staff on Spirit, Jennifer Verne, our research manager and our producer, and Heather Lawson, our trainer on Spirit and our podcast director, for helping make these podcasts possible. My chief of staff, Andrew Brooks, for his guidance and help on the scripts, and everyone else involved. Thank you so much. See you next time. Until then, stay safe and remember the truth is out there. Good night. Ghost to Ghost podcast and its contents is the property of Spirit Paranormal Ltd. All rights reserved. We welcome you to download and play the podcast and share with others for personal use. You may not, except with written permission, use or distribute its contents for commercial use. Spirit Indiana Paranormal, covering the Hoosier State since 2002, Indy's oldest parapsychology investigation group. If you're experiencing what you believe to be paranormal issues, reach out to us for help at www.spiritindiana.com or call our hotline at 317-883-9103. Again, that is www.spiritindiana.com or our hotline at 317-883-9103. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself and the ones you love, and be safe out there.